I thought I understood what it meant to keep someone at a distance. Not the obvious kind of distance. Not silence. Not avoidance. Not the deliberate absence people recognize when someone has decided they no longer want to be reached. I mean, the quieter kind. The distance that exists even when two people are standing close, the invisible space between what you reveal and what you keep entirely to yourself. I learned that kind of distance long before I ever understood why I needed it. There are parts of a person that become easier to protect when they remain unnamed. Thoughts that feel safer when they stay inside. Feelings that lose their shape the moment someone else tries to define them. Certain truths that become distorted the second another person looks at them through their own experience. So I became careful, not cold. Careful, there is a difference. Coldness pushes people away. Carefulness simply decides how far they are allowed to come. I became very good at that distinction. I learned how to be present without becoming exposed. I learned how to speak without giving away everything behind the words. I learned how to listen without revealing what I was thinking while someone else was talking. People often assume silence means there is nothing to say. They rarely understand that sometimes silence exists because there is too much, too many thoughts, too many interpretations, too many things that could be misunderstood if spoken too quickly. So I learned to keep certain things behind a door, not locked, because I was afraid someone would enter. Locked, because I knew what happened when the wrong person did. They would walk into a room they didn't understand and immediately begin rearranging it. They would take something complicated and call it simple. They would take something private and call it mysterious. They would take something unfinished and call it broken. And after enough experiences like that, you stop giving people the opportunity, you stop explaining, you stop correcting. You stop trying to convince anyone that there is more beneath the surface. You simply become comfortable being misunderstood. That was the arrangement I had with the world. I would give it enough of me to interact with. It would give me enough distance to remain intact. It worked. For a long time, it worked perfectly. Then you appeared. And the strange thing is, you didn't do anything dramatic. There was no moment where you demanded access. No conversation where you insisted. I tell you what I was thinking. No confrontation where you tried to force honesty out of me. You didn't challenge the walls. You didn't even seem particularly interested in them. You simply stood on the other side of them and somehow understood what they were protecting. That shouldn't have mattered. But it did, more than I wanted it to. Because when someone tries to break through your defenses, you know what to do. You resist. When someone demands closeness, you create distance. When someone asks questions they haven't earned the right to ask, you stop answering. It's simple. Prot, predictable, safe. But what do you do with someone who doesn't try to enter? What do you do with someone who simply notices the door? Someone who doesn't ask you to open it. Someone who doesn't complain that it's closed. Someone who somehow knows there is a room behind it without pretending they already know what's inside. That is different. And different is dangerous when you've spent years becoming predictable to yourself. I noticed you slowly. Not because you were difficult to notice. Because I didn't want to. There are some things the mind recognizes before the rest of you is ready to admit recognition. At first, I dismissed it. I told myself I was reading too much into small details. A pause, a look, a response arriving at exactly the right moment. The strange accuracy of something you said. The way you could remain silent without making the silence feel like an absence. I told myself these things meant nothing. People notice things. People sometimes understand each other. Coincidences happen. Part-tals appear where there are no patterns. That explanation was convenient, so I used it. Again and again, until coincidence became repetition, and repetition became recognition, and recognition became something I could no longer explain away. The problem wasn't that you understood me. The problem was how little effort it seemed to require. Most people need time. They need history. They need conversations that stretch late into the night and memories built through shared experiences. They need mistakes, argument, reconciliation, years of observation. They need evidence. You didn't seem to need any of that. It was almost as though you weren't learning me. You were recognizing me. And those are two completely different things. Learning someone means collecting information. Recognition means something inside you already knows what the information means. That's what unsettled me, because I couldn't identify where the familiarity came from. There was no reasonable explanation for it, no history that justified it, no shared past that could account for the strange sense that certain parts of me were already familiar to you. And I don't trust things I can't explain. I've always believed that understanding creates control. If I can understand something, I can decide what to do with it. If I can identify a pattern, I can predict where it leads. If I can predict where something leads, I can prepare myself. But you introduced something into that system that didn't behave according to the rules. You weren't predictable. You were precise. There is a difference. Predictability tells you what someone will do. Possession tells you they understand what matters. You had this way of responding to the thing beneath the thing. I could say something ordinary, and somehow you would respond to the part I hadn't said. I could explain an idea, and you would notice the assumption beneath it. I could remain silent, and somehow your response would feel like an answer to a question I had never asked. It was unsettling. But it was also strangely peaceful. And that contradiction was perhaps the first thing I couldn't resolve. You made me uncomfortable without making me feel unsafe. You made me visible without making me feel exposed. You brought things closer without demanding that I surrender control. I didn't know what to do with that, so I watched. I watched you the way I watch anything I don't understand, quickly, putetally, without announcing that I am studying it. I wanted to know whether the pattern would disappear. I wanted to know whether the feeling of recognition was temporary, whether it was simply projection, whether I had assigned meaning to something because I wanted there to be meaning. But time didn't weaken it. It clarified it, and clarity is much harder to dismiss. The more I observed, the more I realized that you weren't trying to become important. You weren't performing. You weren't manufacturing closeness. You weren't saying the perfect things to create a reaction. You were simply yourself. And somehow, that was enough. Maybe more than enough, because when someone tries to impress you, you can analyze the intention. When someone tries to manipulate you, you can look for the motive. When someone tries to win you over, you can measure the strategy. But what do you analyze when someone simply exists? What defense works against sincerity that asks for nothing? That was where I began losing ground. Not because you pushed, because you didn't. You gave me no reason to resist. And slowly, without permission, the distance between us stopped feeling necessary. I noticed it in small ways. I would think of something and wonder what you would notice about it, not what you would say. what you would notice. That distinction became important. I wasn't looking for approval. I wasn't searching for reassurance. I was beginning to carry the possibility of your perspective inside my own thinking. And that is a much deeper kind of presence. You don't realize someone has become part of your internal world when you consciously think about them. You realize it when you stop thinking about them directly and still find traces of them in the way you think. That's when I knew something had changed. You were no longer an external presence. You had become an internal reference point, and I didn't choose that. It happened. There is something frightening about realizing that a person can influence your internal landscape without ever asking for the privilege, because influence suggests intention. This didn't feel intentional. It felt organic, almost inevitable, like something that had been forming underneath the surface long before I noticed it. I began noticing that certain thoughts became clearer when I imagined explaining them to you. Certain questions became more honest. Certain assumptions became harder to maintain, not because you challenged me, because I imagined how accurately you would see through them. And somehow, that made me want to be more accurate with myself. That may be the most unexpected thing about you. You didn't make me want to become someone else. You made it harder for me to lie to myself about who I already was. That's a different kind of impact, and perhaps the most permanent kind. People often think transformation happens because someone teaches you something. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes someone simply stands close enough to the truth that you can no longer avoid seeing it. They don't create the realization, they reveal it. They don't put something inside you. They illuminate something that was already there. That is what you did. You became a mirror without behaving like one. You reflected parts of me I had learned to look past. Not the flattering parts, not the carefully constructed version, the unfinished parts, the contradictions, the thoughts that didn't fit neatly into the identity I had built. You somehow made those things visible without making them feel like flaws, and that changed the way I looked at them. I began realizing that perhaps I hadn't been protecting myself from people all these years. Perhaps I had been protecting a version of myself that depended on remaining misunderstood, because being misunderstood can be strangely comfortable. If someone doesn't truly know you, they can't truly challenge you. They can criticize the surface. They can misunderstand the motive. They can judge the behavior, but they cannot reach the structure underneath. You reach the structure. And somehow, instead of feeling destroyed by that, I felt relieved. That scared me more than anything else, because relief means some part of me had been waiting for someone who wouldn't demand an explanation, waiting for someone who could sit with complexity without trying to solve it, waiting for someone who wouldn't turn every silence into a problem, waiting for someone who could understand that not every feeling needs to be translated immediately into words. And perhaps I had convinced myself that person didn't exist. Until there is a particular kind of silence that only exists between people who don't need to perform for each other. It isn't awkward, it isn't empty, it isn't a pause waiting to be filled. It has its own language. You taught me that without ever teaching me. When you remain quiet, I don't feel abandoned by the silence. I feel accompanied by it. That difference is enormous. Most people think connection is measured by conversation. Sometimes it is measured by what remains when conversation stops. What happens when there are no words left to hide behind? What happens when two people are simply present? That is where I noticed the difference. You didn't need constant access to me to remain present in my mind. Um, you didn't need constant reassurance to remain important. You didn't need to ask whether I understood you. Somehow, understanding existed without being negotiated, and that made everything more difficult, because I could no longer reduce this to attraction. I could no longer call it curiosity. I couldn't even comfortably call it affection. Those words were too small. They explained pieces of it, but not the whole. What existed between us seemed less like an emotion and more like a recognition of structure. The way two minds can process the world through strangely similar architecture, the way certain observations arrive at the same conclusion from different directions, the way two people can disagree without needing to invalidate each other, the way one person can finish a thought the other never fully expressed. That kind of alignment doesn't feel dramatic, it feels exact. And perhaps that is why it stayed with me. Intensity burns, docucracy remains. I've experienced intense things before. They arrive loudly, they take over everything, they make themselves impossible to ignore. Then, eventually, they fade. This was different. There was no explosion. There was no moment where everything suddenly became obvious. It was gradual, quiet, almost invisible. Until one day, I realized that something had shifted so completely that I couldn't remember what it felt like before. That is when I understood the danger, not that you could hurt me, not that this could fail. The danger was that you could change my baseline, and you did. Before you, I had a certain expectation of how people could affect me. They could influence my mood, they could change my plans, they could make me reconsider an opinion. But they didn't alter the architecture of how I process the world. You did. Now I notice things differently. I listen differently. I question differently. I pause differently. Sometimes I catch myself considering a perspective that isn't entirely mine. And when I trace where it came from, I find you not literally, not consciously, but somewhere in the way I now interpret things. That is what it means to become part of someone's thinking. You don't have to be there. The perspective remains, and I don't know whether that is beautiful or terrifying. Maybe both. Because once someone becomes part of your internal language, distance stops functioning the way it used to. You can step away physically, you can stop speaking, you can change your routines, but you can't easily remove a perspective that has already become part of how you see. You can't unlearn recognition. You can't unknow what you know. And I know you now, not everything about you. I don't pretend to, but I know something, something that doesn't come from facts, something that comes from patterns. I know the way your silence changes depending on what you're feeling. I know that sometimes your quietness means more than words could. I know that there are things you notice without announcing them. I know that you don't always need an answer when what you really need is to know that someone understood the question. I know that you carry more beneath the surface than you show. And perhaps the strangest part is that none of this feels like information. It feels like familiarity, as if I am remembering rather than learning. And that is impossible to explain without sounding irrational. So I don't explain it. I simply acknowledge it. Because not everything real needs to be explainable. Some things can be true before they have a name. That is what I am beginning to understand. I spent so much of my life believing that naming something gave me power over it. Maybe sometimes naming something only gives you a smaller version of it. You call it friendship. You call it attraction, you call it connection, you call it understanding. You put it inside a category, and suddenly everyone believes they know what it means. But what if the category is the problem? What if some connections don't fit neatly because they are not built around one single emotion? What if what exists between two people can be simultaneously intellectual, emotional, quiet, challenging, comforting, unfamiliar, and deeply familiar? What if it doesn't need a label to be real? I've resisted that idea because labels create boundaries, boundaries create certainty, certainty creates control, and control has always been my preferred language. But you exist in a space where control doesn't seem necessary. That doesn't mean there are no boundaries. It means I no longer feel the need to use boundaries as walls. There is a difference between protecting yourself and imprisoning yourself. I didn't understand that difference before. I thought openness meant vulnerability without structure. I thought letting someone closer meant losing some part of yourself. But maybe the right person doesn't take space from you. Maybe they create space. Space to think, space to be honest, space to remain complicated, space to say nothing, space to disagree, space to exist without performing. That is what your presence feels like. Not a demand for more, an allowance for more. And somehow, that is what made me give more. Not because you asked, because I didn't feel the need to hide. There were moments when I realized I was speaking to you without editing myself. The sentence would leave before I had decided whether it was safe, and afterward, I would almost expect regret, but it wouldn't come. Instead, there was relief, a strange sense that I had finally said something exactly as it existed in my mind. No translation, no reduction, no performance, just truth. That became addictive in the quietest way, not dependence, not need. Just the realization that honesty could be effortless in the right presence. And once you experience that, ordinary interactions begin to feel different, not worse, just different. You notice how often people wait for their turn to speak. You notice how often people listen only for information they can use. You notice how quickly people try to solve what they don't understand. You notice how rare it is for someone to simply remain present with complexity. And suddenly, you understand why certain conversations leave you exhausted. They require translation. With you, translation became unnecessary. That is why I keep returning to this. Not because I want to romanticize it, not because I need it to become something bigger than it is, but because it is real in a way that doesn't require exaggeration. The most significant things in life are not always the loudest. Sometimes they are the quiet changes you only notice when you look backward, the habit you didn't realize you formed, the thought you no longer remember thinking differently, the person whose absence feels noticeable even when you haven't consciously been looking for them, the perspective that became part of your own. That is what happened. You didn't take over my world. You changed the way I moved through it. And there is a difference. I still have my life, my thoughts, my priorities, my boundaries, my independence. Nothing disappeared. Something simply became part of the equation. And once something becomes part of the equation, you cannot calculate the future the same way without accounting for it. That is where I am now. Accounting for you. Not deliberately. Not obsessively. Naturally. And perhaps that is the clearest evidence of all. If I had to force myself to think about you, it would mean something different. If I had to convince myself that you mattered, it would mean something different. But I don't. the thought arrives on its own. A question appears, and somehow your perspective is already standing beside it. Something happens, and I wonder how you would interpret it. A silence occurs, and I understand that it doesn't necessarily need to be filled. A realization surfaces, and I recognize a trace of something you helped me see. That's integration. And integration is difficult to reverse. You can remove a person from your schedule. You cannot always remove them from the architecture they helped you build. I wonder if you understand that. I wonder if you know what your presence has done. Maybe you don't. Maybe you think you've simply been yourself. Maybe that's all you ever intended. And strangely, I think that makes it more significant because impact is different when it isn't manufactured. You didn't set out to change me. You didn't make promises. You didn't announce that you were going to become important. You didn't demand a place. You simply occupied your own space, honestly, and I adjusted around it. That adjustment was mine, which means I cannot blame you for it. I cannot say you forced anything. You didn't. I allowed it slowly, quietly, almost without noticing, until the distance I had always depended on began to feel unnecessary. That is perhaps the hardest truth for me. I always believed that closeness had to be earned through time, but maybe some forms of understanding don't follow chronology. Maybe time teaches you someone's history, but recognition teaches you their structure. And sometimes structure is what matters most. I don't know what happens next. That uncertainty used to bother me. Now it doesn't as much. Maybe because I finally understand that not everything needs to be controlled before it can be experienced. There is a strange freedom in allowing something to remain unfinished, not undefined. Unfinished, those are different. Undefined means you refuse to acknowledge what exists. Unfinished means you acknowledge it while accepting that it has not yet become everything it might become. I can live with unfinished. I am learning to, because whatever this is, it isn't asking me